Picture a world where entire families vanish overnight, where streets are piled with corpses, and where the air itself seems poisoned with death. This wasn't some horror story. It was everyday reality during the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history. By the time this nightmare ended, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population lay dead. But what if I told you the true impact went far beyond just the staggering death toll? The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it shattered the medieval world, rewriting the rules of society, religion, and even human biology in ways that still echo today. Most history books only scratch the surface of how this plague transformed civilization. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover 25 shocking facts that reveal how the Black Death didn't just change medieval Europe, it created the modern world as we know it. From genetic mutations that still protect people today, to the bizarre plague cures that killed more than they saved, to the secret economic revolution sparked by mass death, what you're about to discover will forever change how you see this apocalyptic chapter of history. And here's the most chilling part of all. We're still living with the consequences of those terrifying years 6 centuries later. Now let's put that apocalyptic scale into perspective. Historians estimate the Black Death wiped out between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in just 4 terrifying years. To grasp how catastrophic that was, imagine if 2 out of every 3 people you know, your family, friends, co-workers, simply vanished. In modern terms, that's like the entire populations of France, Germany, and Spain dying in half a decade. But here's what makes it even more chilling: the plague didn't kill evenly. Some towns were completely erased from the map. Take the English village of Warham, Percy, where archaeological digs revealed houses abandoned mid-meal, their skeletons still clustered around hearths. Or the Italian port of Tonna, once a bustling trade hub, where contemporary accounts describe streets so littered with bodies that ships bypassed it for decades. Even monasteries, supposedly protected by divine favor, saw death rates as high as 80%. Imagine every 4 out of 5 monks in a cloister dying before summer's end. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a demographic catastrophe that left fields untended, workshops empty, and an entire generation of children orphaned. The few survivors wrote of towns where the living was scarcely enough to bury the dead, and where wolves roamed deserted farmlands. When we say the Black Death reshaped history, we're talking about a world where the basic fabric of community unraveled overnight. And as we'll see next, that breakdown had consequences no one could have predicted. But here's where the horror truly escalates: the Black Death didn't creep across Europe. It exploded. Merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers unwittingly turned medieval trade routes into superhighways for the plague. Picture this: a single infected rat stowing away on a grain ship leaving Constantinople in 1347. Within weeks, that ship docks in Sicily, where half the crew is already dead. Panicked locals flee inland, but it's too late. The disease leaps from port to port like wildfire, reaching Venice by spring. By summer, it's in Marseille, by autumn, Paris, all before anyone even understood what was killing them. The speed wasn't just terrifying, it defied logic. Most medieval illnesses took years to cross continents. The plague did it in months. Why? Medieval cities were perfect breeding grounds. Streets choked with filth, houses packed shoulder to shoulder, no sewage systems, ideal conditions for flea-infested rats. In Florence, chroniclers wrote of 10,000 people dying in a single month. London lost nearly half its population in 18 gruesome weeks, and in the worst-hit places, the timeline was even more unthinkable. The city of Tournai in modern-day Belgium recorded its first case on a Friday. By Sunday, mass graves were being dug. By Wednesday, the gravediggers themselves were dead. But perhaps the cruelest twist: the very networks that built Europe's wealth doomed it. The Silk Road didn't just carry silks and spices, it transported death. Mongol traders fleeing outbreaks in Central Asia brought it to Crimea. Italian merchants fleeing Crimea brought it to Europe. Each stop was a new ignition point. And once it reached a city, social hierarchies meant nothing. Rich and poor died side by side. In Avignon, the papal court watched helplessly as the plague killed 9 cardinals and 80 bishops in 1 year. Even quarantines failed when Venice barred ships from docking. Smugglers simply rowed ashore at night, carrying infected fleas with them. What made this speed so psychologically devastating? Imagine waking up healthy, then watching your neighbor die by noon, your priest by evening, your entire family by week's end. No wonder survivors described the air itself feeling thick with doom. By the time villagers realized the danger, it was often too late to run. And as we'll see next, the plague's brutality wasn't limited to just one form. It had multiple faces, each deadlier than the last. Now the horror takes an even darker turn. While the bubonic plague was devastating enough, the Black Death had 2 even deadlier variations waiting in the shadows: pneumonic and septicemic plague. Imagine the terror when victims realized the swollen lymph nodes and feverish agony of bubonic plague weren't the worst it could do. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, turning every cough into a death sentence. Unlike the bubonic form, which relied on fleas, this strain spread directly through the air. Just breathing near an infected person could seal your fate. Symptoms erupted with brutal speed: violent chest pain, coughing up blood, and a suffocating inability to draw breath. Chroniclers described victims drowning in their own fluids within 48 hours. Even worse, it had a near 100% fatality rate. Towns already reeling from bubonic outbreaks would suddenly face entire households collapsing after a single conversation. In crowded medieval cities where people lived practically on top of each other, pneumonic plague turned markets, churches, and homes into death traps. Then there was septicemic plague, the rarest but most gruesome form. Here, the bacteria didn't settle in lymph nodes or lungs, it flooded the bloodstream. Skin turned black from internal bleeding, fingers and toes rotted away from gangrene, and death often came within a day. Some victims reportedly went to bed healthy and were found corpse black by morning. Unlike bubonic plague, which gave days of suffering, septicemic plague offered no warning. It was like lightning striking, untreatable, unstoppable, and almost always fatal. Why were these forms so much deadlier? Bubonic plague at least gave a slim fighting chance. Some survived if their immune systems resisted long enough. But pneumonic and septicemic versions bypassed those defenses entirely. One ravaged the body's oxygen supply, the other its lifeblood. And while bubonic plague required fleas, these strains could spread through coughs or even just a cut on the hand. No medieval medicine could combat them. Here's the chilling part: today's historians suspect pneumonic plague was behind some of the most infamous overnight wipeouts of entire villages. And septicemic cases, they may explain why certain accounts describe healthy men dropping mid-stride. The Black Death wasn't a single monster, it was a trio of horrors, each upping the ante on suffering. And as we'll see next, when faced with this unseen enemy, medieval minds didn't turn to science, they turned to superstition, with consequences just as deadly. But as the death toll climbed, fear twisted into something far darker. Without scientific understanding of how the plague spread, medieval societies grasped for explanations, and their desperate theories spiraled into paranoia and violence. Some pointed to the skies, convinced the alignment of planets had poisoned the air itself. Astrologers claimed Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had aligned in the house of death, releasing a miasma of corrupt vapors. People burned foul-smelling herbs in the streets, believing purifying the air could stop the disease. Others took to carrying posies or holding cloth soaked in vinegar to their noses, certain the plague traveled on foul odors. Then came the conspiracy theories. Rumors spread that Jewish communities were poisoning wells to wipe out Christians, a monstrous lie that led to horrific pogroms. In Strasbourg, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive based on nothing but hysteria. Church authorities even claimed God was punishing humanity for sin, fueling fanatical movements like the Flagellants. These groups would march through towns, whipping themselves bloody in public spectacles of penance, believing self-inflicted torment could appease divine wrath. But the accusations didn't stop there. Doctors wearing their eerie plague masks were sometimes attacked, accused of spreading the disease rather than curing it. Strangers passing through villages risked being lynched as plague spreaders, and in one chilling case, a group of lepers was executed after being falsely accused of conspiring with the Muslim world to unleash the pestilence. What's especially tragic, many of these scapegoats died from the plague anyway. The real enemy wasn't the stars or the Jews or sinners, it was a microscopic bacterium they couldn't see. Yet in their terror, medieval societies turned on each other, creating a second wave of devastation fueled by ignorance and fear. And as we'll see next, this desperation led to another grim reality: mass graves so overwhelmed with bodies that burial customs collapsed entirely. Now consider the chilling reality faced by those who survived the plague but were left to deal with its staggering aftermath. As the Black Death raged, traditional burial practices collapsed under the weight of sheer numbers. Churchyards, once peaceful resting places, became scenes of horror, overflowing with corpses faster than they could be buried. In cities like London and Florence, gravediggers worked around the clock, yet still couldn't keep up. Priests, overwhelmed and often dying themselves, began refusing last rites, leaving families to bury their loved ones in shallow, unmarked pits. In Avignon, witnesses described bodies stacked like firewood in trenches so deep that laborers used ladders to climb down. Some pits held hundreds, even thousands of corpses, layered with lime in a desperate attempt to slow decomposition and curb the stench. In Vienna, the situation grew so dire that authorities commandeered wine barrels to use as makeshift coffins, tossing them into mass graves by the cartload. And in Venice, a gruesome solution emerged. Plague victims were hauled to remote islands like Lazaretto Vecchio, where their bodies were burned in giant pyres that stained the sky with smoke for months. The psychological toll was unimaginable. Survivors spoke of dogs dragging dismembered limbs through deserted streets, or of birds avoiding plague-ridden cities altogether, as if sensing death in the air. In some towns, entire families were buried together in their homes, their houses then demolished over them as crude tombs. The scale of loss was so vast that archaeologists today still uncover mass graves like one in Lincolnshire, England, where skeletal remains show the telltale signs of bubonic infection, clustered together in silent testimony to the panic of the moment. What's haunting is how these emergency measures became permanent scars on the landscape. Centuries later, construction projects from subway diggers to backyard gardeners continue to unearth these forgotten pits, a grim reminder of how the Black Death didn't just kill, it reshaped the very earth beneath survivors' feet. And as we'll see next, this devastation wasn't limited to humans. Livestock and pets perished in droves too, deepening the crisis in ways no one could have foreseen. But amidst the devastation, nature had a hidden defense. Some people miraculously survived the Black Death, not because of luck or strength, but because their very DNA shielded them. Scientists now believe a specific genetic mutation called CCR5 delta 32 gave certain individuals near total immunity to the plague. This tiny quirk in their genes blocked the bacteria from hijacking their immune cells, turning them into invisible survivors in a sea of death. What's astonishing is how this mutation spread. In plague-ravaged regions, those who carried it were far more likely to live long enough to have children, passing the trait to future generations. Today, around 1 in 10 Europeans still carry this genetic shield, a direct legacy of the Black Death's brutal selection process. In some Scandinavian populations, the rate jumps to nearly 1 in 5, echoing where the plague hit hardest. The irony, this same mutation that once saved lives now plays a role in modern medicine. researchers discovered that CCR5 Delta 32 also makes people resistant to HIV, since the virus uses the same cellular doorway the plague once exploited. It's an eerie reminder of how history's greatest catastrophe left fingerprints on our biology, quietly shaping human health centuries later. Even more haunting are the tales of entire families spared while neighbors perished. In places like Iam, England, a village that famously quarantined itself, certain households inexplicably survived, their bloodlines continuing unbroken. Geneticists now suspect these were clusters of mutation carriers, living proof that survival wasn't just random. The Black Death, in its cruelty, became an unthinkable evolutionary experiment, weeding out the vulnerable and altering human DNA forever. This genetic armor didn't just hide in the shadows of history. It resurfaces in dramatic ways, like the case of an American man cured of both HIV and leukemia after a bone marrow transplant from a donor with 2 copies of CCR5 Delta 32, essentially granting him plague-resistant cells. The past never truly leaves us. It lingers in our blood, in our genes, in the silent battles our bodies still fight with ancient enemies. And as we'll see next, while humans struggled to endure, animals faced their own apocalyptic nightmare. Yet the horror didn't stop at humans. The Black Death's cruelty extended to the animal kingdom, unleashing a silent massacre that deepened society's collapse. While history remembers the piles of human corpses, few realize how farms became graveyards. Livestock dropped dead in fields, their bodies rotting alongside their owners. Cows, sheep, and goats central to medieval survival succumbed to the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis, turning pastures into wastelands. The scale was catastrophic. In some regions, entire herds vanished overnight. Chroniclers wrote of villages where not a single chicken remained, and fields littered with the stiffened bodies of oxen still hitched to plows. This wasn't just a loss of food, it was the unraveling of an economic system. Milk, wool, leather, and labor animals vanished, crippling industries from textiles to agriculture. With no beasts to pull carts or till soil, famine tightened its grip on survivors already drowning in grief. The devastation rippled up the social ladder. Nobles who relied on livestock taxes saw their wealth evaporate. Monasteries which bred sheep for Europe's booming wool trade found their coffers empty. And for peasants, the death of a single cow could mean starvation. Imagine a world where a family's survival hinged on one dairy animal, then imagine it rotting in the barn. The psychological toll was as crushing as the hunger, but here's the twist. Some animals weren't victims, they were accomplices. Rats and fleas famously spread the plague, but historians now suspect other carriers. Dogs and cats, blamed by terrified communities, were slaughtered en masse in misguided attempts to curb the disease. Tragically, this backfired. With fewer predators, rodent populations exploded, accelerating outbreaks. Even today, scientists study how the Black Death reshaped animal ecosystems, from the extinction of certain medieval dog breeds to the rise of hardier rat populations. The legacy of this animal holocaust lingered for generations. In England, the price of a plough horse soared to 6 times its pre-plague value, reflecting the desperate scarcity. Laws were passed to force peasants to rebuild herds, but recovery took decades. And in art, the imagery shifted. Where once tapestries glowed with pastoral scenes, skeletons of livestock began haunting margins of manuscripts. This was nature's grim equalizer. The plague didn't care if you walked on 2 legs or 4. It turned life's most basic rhythms, planting, harvesting, breeding, into impossible tasks. And as we'll see next, when desperation peaked, even healers became part of the spectacle, clad in costumes as terrifying as the disease itself. Now let's turn to the healers themselves, those who faced the horror head-on, armed with little more than superstition and a costume straight out of nightmares. Plague doctors, with their infamous beaked masks, became walking symbols of despair during the Black Death. These eerie figures, dressed head to toe in waxed coats and leather gloves, were medieval Europe's last line of defense. But their most chilling feature, those hollow, bird-like beaks stuffed with herbs like lavender, mint, and myrrh. The theory behind the mask was rooted in the miasma theory, the belief that bad air spread disease. Doctors thought the fragrant herbs would purify the toxic fumes before they reached the wearer's lungs. Some even doused the mask in vinegar or rosewater, hoping to block the imagined poison. The long beak also kept patients at a distance, offering a crude barrier against droplets, ironically, an early nod to social distancing. But let's be clear, this was theater, not science. The plague wasn't in the air. It traveled via fleas and bodily fluids, rendering the herb-filled beak useless against the real threat. Their entire outfit was a desperate gamble. The waxed cloak and gloves meant to repel evil vapors, not bacteria. The wooden cane used to examine patients without touch or to keep grieving families at bay. Some doctors even carried torches, believing fire could burn away the corrupt air. Yet for all their elaborate precautions, plague doctors died at staggering rates. Many were second-rate physicians or even quacks hired by panicked towns when real doctors fled. Others were young medics just starting their careers, lured by inflated wages, only to find themselves presiding over mass graves. The mask's psychological impact, though, was undeniable. To a suffering village, the sight of that beak emerging from the mist signaled doom. Parents hid children from these figures, not out of fear of infection, but because their arrival often meant a death sentence for someone in the household. And in a cruel twist, the mask's design may have worsened the terror. The hollow eyes, the eerie silence, doctors couldn't even offer comforting words through the thick leather. Yet here's the tragic irony. While the outfit failed as protection, it inadvertently pioneered an early concept of hazmat gear. Centuries later, during the Spanish flu, medical teams would adopt similar full-body coverings, but with one critical difference: science. The plague doctor's costume stands as a haunting reminder of humanity's struggle to confront the unknown, armed with little more than hope and a handful of herbs. And just when you think the desperation couldn't deepen, the Black Death reshaped society in ways no one saw coming, like toppling the very foundation of medieval power. But that's a story for another moment. But the Black Death's chaos didn't just leave bodies in its wake, it shattered an entire social order. Imagine a world where half the workforce vanishes overnight. That's exactly what happened in medieval Europe, and the ripple effects toppled feudalism itself. Before the plague, society ran on a brutal hierarchy. Peasants, often serfs bound to the land, worked tirelessly for nobles, receiving little more than meager shelter and scraps in return. They couldn't leave, negotiate wages, or refuse labor. But when the plague wiped out roughly half the population, everything changed. Suddenly, fields lay empty, harvests rotted, and lords faced a crisis. No one was left to work their estates. This wasn't just a labor shortage, it was a seismic power shift. Surviving peasants realized their worth overnight. With fewer workers, their skills became priceless. They began demanding payment for their labor, something unthinkable before the plague. In England, for example, the government panicked, passing the Statute of Labourers in 1351 to cap wages and force peasants back into serfdom. But the law failed spectacularly. Workers simply fled to estates offering better pay, ignoring old feudal bonds. Lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, had no choice but to comply. The bargaining power of peasants surged. Some negotiated annual wages instead of lifelong servitude. Others abandoned farms entirely for cities, where skilled labor fetched even higher prices. Women, historically confined to domestic roles, took on jobs as blacksmiths, brewers, and even merchants, filling gaps left by the dead. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the illusion that nobility was untouchable. And the upheaval wasn't just economic. The church, long a pillar of feudal control, lost credibility as prayers failed to stop the dying. peasants began questioning divine right, the idea that God ordained their suffering. Revolts erupted, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where commoners stormed London demanding fair treatment. Though crushed brutally, these rebellions proved the old order was unraveling. By the time the dust settled, feudalism was on life support. Landlords shifted to renting plots instead of demanding forced labor, creating Europe's first tenant farmers. The concept of a wage economy took root, paving the way for modern capitalism. The Black Death didn't just depopulate Europe, it democratized it, proving that even the mightiest systems crumble when the people who uphold them realize their power. And just when you think the plague's influence couldn't stretch further, consider this. It didn't just reshape society, it rewrote art, religion, and even how we mourn. But that's a revelation for another moment. But the aftermath of the Black Death wasn't just a temporary shock, it left wounds that took generations to heal. Picture this, Europe's population didn't bounce back overnight. In fact, it took 200 long years for numbers to return to pre-plague levels. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. Entire regions became ghost towns, with fields swallowed by forests and villages crumbling into ruins. The scale of the loss was staggering. Before the plague, Europe's population hovered around 75 million. By the time the deaths slowed, that number had plummeted to as low as 30 million. To put that in perspective, imagine every person in California, Texas, and New York vanishing 3 times over. Cities like Florence lost 3/4 of their inhabitants. Rural areas fared even worse, with some losing 90% of their people. The land itself seemed to mourn as untended farms turned to wilderness. Recovery wasn't just slow, it was uneven. Some regions, like parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, remained eerily empty for centuries. Villages abandoned during the plague were never resettled, their names fading from maps. In England, nearly 1 in 3 villages disappeared entirely. Archaeologists still find remnants of these forgotten communities, crumbling church walls, overgrown millstones, silent witnesses to the catastrophe. Why did it take so long? For starters, the plague didn't just strike once. It returned in waves every decade or so, each outbreak culling the population anew. Survivors of the first wave might succumb to the next, leaving fewer families to rebuild. Birth rates also plummeted. With so many adults dead, marriages were delayed and fewer children were born. Even when couples did start families, malnutrition thanks to collapsed food systems meant many infants didn't survive. The economic paralysis deepened the crisis. With fewer workers, crops rotted in fields, triggering famines that killed even more. Trade networks collapsed, leaving communities isolated. Without enough people to maintain infrastructure, bridges collapsed, roads vanished, and knowledge was lost. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, masons, weavers died without passing on their crafts, creating shortages that stalled rebuilding. Yet amidst the desolation, there were glimmers of change. The labor shortages that toppled feudalism also spurred innovation. Farmers experimented with new crops and tools to work land more efficiently. Abandoned villages were consolidated, creating more productive hubs. And as populations slowly regrew, cities adapted, designing wider streets and better sanitation to prevent future outbreaks. The scars of the Black Death lingered in unexpected ways too. Folk tales from the era are steeped in loss, with stories of phantom villages and cursed lands. Even today, place names like Pesthugal Plague Hill in Germany or Deadman's Lane in England whisper of the trauma. The plague didn't just kill people, it erased whole chapters of history, leaving gaps we're still piecing together. And just when Europe began to regain its footing, another shock awaited, one that would test the resilience of survivors all over again. But even as Europe struggled to rebuild, another disturbing response to the plague was taking hold, one that turned fear into fanaticism. When reason failed to explain the horror, many clung to religion for answers, but not in ways you might expect. Some became convinced the Black Death was divine punishment, and their desperate attempts to atone for humanity's sins spiraled into something terrifying. Enter the flagellants, a radical movement that swept across towns like a second plague. These groups, often hundreds strong, would march barefoot through the streets, their robes marked with crosses, chanting hymns of repentance. Then, in a gruesome public spectacle, they'd strip to the waist and whip their own backs with iron-tipped scourges until blood ran down their bodies. They believed this self-punishment could appease God's wrath and spare their communities from further suffering. The rituals grew even more extreme. Some flagellants inserted shards of glass or nails into their whips to intensify the pain. Others crawled on broken pottery or lay in crosses formed from the bleeding bodies of their fellows. Witnesses described scenes of mass hysteria, with onlookers joining in, convinced the only path to salvation was through suffering. Church authorities initially tolerated the movement, seeing it as genuine piety until it spun out of control. Because here's the twist, the flagellants didn't just blame themselves. They began targeting outsiders, accusing Jews, lepers, and even priests of conspiring to spread the plague. Mobs, whipped into frenzy by their sermons, attacked Jewish neighborhoods, burning homes and massacring entire communities. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were slaughtered in a single day based on baseless rumors of poison plots. The flagellants' message had mutated from penance to persecution. The Church, alarmed by the chaos, finally banned the movement in 1349, but the damage was done. The flagellant craze revealed how easily fear could twist faith into violence. Their legacy wasn't just scars on their own backs, it was a dark blueprint for how societies, when faced with unimaginable crisis, so often turn on the marginalized. And tragically, this wouldn't be the last time. The paranoia they fueled would resurface in later witch hunts, pogroms, and even public health scares for centuries to come. Yet amid this fervor, another unexpected group emerged: wealthy families who thought they could outrun death itself. But as we'll see next, their flight often carried the plague with them, spreading the devastation even further. Now, let's turn to a grim irony of the Black Death, how the very people who thought they could escape it ended up spreading it further. As panic gripped Europe's cities, the wealthy did what the wealthy have always done in crises: they used their resources to flee. Nobles, merchants, and even doctors packed their carriages with valuables and rushed to their secluded country estates, believing distance would save them. But in their haste, they overlooked one fatal detail. The plague wasn't just in the crowded streets, it was in their luggage, their clothes, and worst of all, in their own bodies. Take the story of a prominent Florentine merchant who fled to his vineyard outside the city walls, only to collapse with fever 3 days later. By the time his family realized what was happening, the disease had already jumped to his servants, then to the nearby village. Entire rural communities, once isolated from the worst of the outbreak, were wiped out because one privileged traveler brought death with him. This wasn't an isolated case. In England, records show how noble families retreating to their manors inadvertently turned these safe havens into plague hotspots. A single infected servant could doom an entire household, and with no understanding of contagion, the cycle repeated endlessly. The tragedy deepened because rural areas were utterly unprepared. Cities at least had some infrastructure, hospitals, however rudimentary, or quarantine measures like Venice's. But villages lacked even basic defenses. A lord's arrival should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, it became a death sentence. Peasants who'd never seen the plague before suddenly found themselves burying whole families in a matter of weeks. And the wealthy, many didn't survive either. Their money bought them escape, but not immunity. Perhaps the most haunting twist was how this exodus reshaped the plague's spread. Maps of outbreaks reveal a chilling pattern: waves of death radiating outward from cities along the very routes nobles used to flee. Roads that should have been arteries of safety became highways for the pestilence. By trying to outrun the Black Death, the elites became its unwitting couriers, proving a hard truth: no one was safe, and privilege could be as deadly as poverty. This futile flight reveals a universal lesson about pandemics. Fear often drives people to actions that worsen the crisis, and as we'll see next, the desperation didn't stop there. Some towns took even more extreme measures, burning down their own homes in a last-ditch effort to survive. But as the Black Death reshaped lives, it also reshaped art, ushering in an era of haunting imagery that mirrored the despair of the times. Imagine walking into a medieval church and being greeted not by scenes of saints, but by grinning skeletons dragging kings and peasants alike into the grave. This was the rise of the danse macabre, or dance of death, a chilling artistic genre that became Europe's coping mechanism for unimaginable loss. Artists once focused on religious glory now painted mortality with brutal honesty. In frescoes across France and Germany, skeletal figures waltzed with the living popes, emperors, and beggars, all equal in death's grasp. The message was unmistakable: no wealth or power could spare you. One famous example from Basel shows a skeletal musician leading a chain of doomed dancers, their faces twisted in resignation. Even children weren't spared in these depictions. Their tiny skeletons served as grim reminders of the plague's cruelty. Literature echoed this shift. Poems personified death as a reaper who mocked human vanity, while manuscripts brimmed with marginalia of skeletons farming or baking bread, mundane tasks turned macabre. The Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying, became a bestseller, teaching readers how to face death properly in an age when sudden demise was routine. But why this obsession with the morbid? Scholars argue it was a form of collective therapy. By confronting death head-on, artists gave terrified communities a way to process grief and the randomness of survival. A nobleman's portrait might hang beside a memento mori skull, whispering, "You could be next." The irony: this dark creativity birthed some of the period's most enduring art, proving even horror could inspire beauty. And just as these works captured despair, they also hinted at rebellion. Some depictions showed skeletons looting treasure or wearing crowns, a subtle jab at elites who'd failed to protect the people. Art became one of the few spaces where societal anger could safely simmer. What's fascinating is how these themes persist. Modern horror, from Tim Burton's films to Game of Thrones' bleakness, owes a debt to the plague's artistic legacy. The Dance of Death wasn't just medieval macabre, it was humanity's first viral meme, spreading not through fleas but through brushes and quills. And as we'll see next, this cultural shift was just one ripple in the plague's vast wake. Venice's desperate bid for survival would give the world a tool we still use today: quarantine. Now, let's turn to a lasting legacy of the Black Death that still shapes our world today: the very concept of quarantine. Picture Venice in the year 1348, a city teetering on the edge of collapse, as ships laden with goods and, unknowingly, plague docked in its bustling ports. The city's leaders faced an impossible choice: shut down trade and starve, or stay open and risk annihilation. Their solution, a radical new idea called quarantina, from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Venice's Great Council decreed that all arriving ships and travelers had to anchor offshore for 40 days before setting foot in the city. The logic was eerily prescient. Medieval doctors may not have understood germs, but they noticed patterns. Symptoms often appeared within a month. By isolating potential carriers, Venice hoped to break the chain of transmission. And it worked, sort of. While the plague still ravaged the city, the 40-day rule slowed its spread, buying time for makeshift hospitals and burials. But why 40 days? The number wasn't arbitrary. It echoed biblical symbolism: Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, Noah's 40 days of flood, lending divine authority to the policy. Authorities even stationed guards on remote islands like Lazaretto Nuovo, where merchants waited in grim isolation. Surviving records describe ships' crews waving white flags to signal they were disease-free, a medieval version of a clean bill of health. Other cities soon copied Venice's playbook. Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, built the first purpose-built quarantine facility in 1377, enforcing 30-day isolations later extended to 40. Marseille adopted the practice after losing half its population in a single outbreak. Over time, quarantine became a cornerstone of public health, evolving into the systems we recognize today. The irony, Venice's innovation came at a brutal cost. Isolated ships became floating tombs, with crews dying of starvation or plague before their 40 days ended. Some desperate travelers jumped into the sea, only to wash ashore and spread the disease anyway. And yet, this imperfect system laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology. The very word quarantine is a linguistic fossil of the Black Death's terror. Fast forward to today, and the echoes are uncanny. From COVID-era lockdowns to airport health screenings, the shadow of Venice's desperation lingers. The plague taught humanity a hard lesson. Survival sometimes demands sacrifice. And as we'll see next, the Black Death didn't just change health policies. It shattered entire economies, leaving villages empty and gold worthless. But let's talk about something even more devastating than the bodies piling up, the economic freefall that followed. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It obliterated the very foundations of medieval economies, leaving behind a world where gold was worthless and bread cost a fortune. Imagine a society where half the workforce vanishes overnight. That's exactly what happened. With so many dead, fields lay fallow, harvests rotted, farms that had fed generations were suddenly abandoned, their owners wiped out by the plague. In England, records show entire villages reclaimed by nature, their wooden huts collapsing into weeds, and here's the cruel twist: with fewer workers to till the soil, food production plummeted. Yet at the same time, demand for basic staples didn't disappear, it just became desperate. The result, hyperinflation. The price of wheat in some regions skyrocketed by 500%. A loaf of bread could cost a day's wages, but it wasn't just food. The plague gutted entire industries. Textile towns like Ypres in Flanders saw their workshops shuttered, their weavers dead. Mines closed because there was no one left to dig. Trade routes, once buzzing with merchants, fell silent, and with no goods moving, markets crashed. In Florence, the great banking families, the Medicis, the Bardis, faced ruin as loans went unpaid and debtors died. The labor shortage should have been a boon for survivors, right? In theory, yes, but feudal lords panicked. They tried to freeze wages, passing laws like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, which capped pay at pre-plague levels. Peasants revolted. In France, the Jacquerie uprising saw serfs burning manor houses. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a direct response to economic oppression. The old order was crumbling, and the plague had lit the fuse. Even currencies collapsed. Silver coins grew scarce as mines closed, so governments debased their coinage, mixing precious metals with cheap alloys. In some places, people resorted to barter: a sack of grain for a pair of shoes, a chicken for a pot. The concept of money itself seemed to unravel, yet from this chaos emerged something unexpected. The scarcity of labor forced lords to offer better terms to peasants. Serfdom began its slow decline. Workers could now demand higher pay or move to towns for opportunity. The plague, in its awful way, had cracked open the rigid feudal system, but the road to recovery would be long. Some markets took decades to rebound. And as we'll see next, the desperation didn't end with economics. It sparked terrifying extremes, like towns setting their own homes on fire in a futile attempt to stop the plague's spread. Now, let's turn to one of the most chilling extremes born from that desperation. When the Black Death's grip seemed unshakable, some towns resorted to an unthinkable tactic, burning everything in sight, even their own homes. Picture this: a disease is ravaging your neighborhood, your family is dying one by one, and no prayer or remedy works. What do you do? For many, the answer was fire. In regions like Italy and Germany, entire streets were set ablaze in a frantic bid to purge the plague. Authorities ordered infected houses to be torched, often with the sick still inside. The logic was brutal but simple. If the disease thrived in filth and close quarters, then destroying those spaces might stop its spread, but fire is indiscriminate. One account from Vienna describes how a single burning house ignited a wind-fueled inferno that consumed half the district. Survivors lost not just loved ones, but everything they owned: homes, heirlooms, even food stores for winter. Some towns took it further. In Marseille, officials didn't wait for symptoms to appear. They preemptively burned down entire neighborhoods where cases had been reported days earlier. Imagine watching your community vanish into smoke on the mere suspicion of plague. And here's the cruel irony: many of these fires didn't just fail to stop the disease, they made things worse. Displaced survivors, now homeless, crowded into nearby areas, creating perfect conditions for the plague to leap anew. The psychological toll was staggering. Chroniclers wrote of families refusing to leave their doomed homes, choosing to die in flames rather than face the plague's agony. Others spoke of looters rushing into burning buildings to grab valuables, only to succumb weeks later. Even the act of burning carried grim symbolism. To medieval minds, fire was both purification and divine punishment, echoing biblical tales of Sodom. Yet amid this horror, there's a haunting lesson. These fiery measures, however desperate, marked some of the earliest attempts at large-scale contagion control. They reveal a grim understanding, however flawed, that the plague thrived in human proximity. Centuries before germ theory, people grasped that isolation could save lives, even if their methods were catastrophic. And as we'll see next, the chaos didn't end with flames. The plague's aftermath reshaped something even more intimate: the very structure of families, leaving children orphaned and dynasties erased in a single generation. Now, let's shift our focus to a quieter, yet no less devastating, consequence of the plague: the way it tore through the very fabric of family life. While flames raged in the streets, another kind of destruction was unfolding behind closed doors, one that would leave scars for generations. The Black Death didn't just claim lives at random, it targeted households with terrifying efficiency. Parents, grandparents, and caregivers died in droves, leaving behind countless children with no one to turn to. In cities like Florence, chroniclers described streets filled with orphans, some so young they couldn't even say their own names. Monasteries and churches overflowed with abandoned children, but even they couldn't keep up. In London, records show that some parishes had more orphaned children than surviving adults to care for them. Imagine a world where the laughter of playing kids was overshadowed by the silence of empty cradles and vacant homes. But here's where society's desperation took a stark turn. With populations decimated, entire villages faced extinction. The solution: early and frequent marriages, often involving shockingly young brides and grooms. In places like England and France, the average age of marriage plummeted. Girls as young as 12 were wed in a frantic bid to repopulate, while boys took on adult responsibilities years before they were ready. Legal documents from the time reveal heartbreaking cases of orphans being forced into marriages simply to secure food and shelter. This wasn't just about love or tradition, it was survival. The plague also shattered inheritance systems. Wealthy dynasties that had stood for centuries collapsed overnight when entire branches of families were wiped out. Estates with no heirs reverted to the crown, creating sudden power shifts. Meanwhile, the few surviving relatives often found themselves inheriting vast, unmanageable properties, a bitter windfall when there were no laborers left to work the land. In some cases, siblings married each other's widows to keep wealth within what little family remained, blurring the lines of kinship in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Yet amid this chaos, there were glimmers of unexpected change. With so many parents gone, extended family networks became vital. aunts, uncles, and even neighbors stepped in to raise children, forging bonds that transcended bloodlines. And for the first time, some women found themselves inheriting property and businesses outright, a rare glimpse of autonomy in a world that had long denied them rights. The legacy of this upheaval lingers even today. Demographic studies show that regions hit hardest by the plague saw lasting shifts in family size and structure, with smaller, more nuclear households becoming the norm. And those early, desperate marriages, they altered genetic diversity in ways scientists are still unraveling. As we'll see next, this wasn't just Europe's tragedy. The plague's shadow stretched far beyond, leaving no continent untouched. Now, let's step beyond Europe's borders and witness the plague's relentless march across continents. While history books often focus on Europe's devastation, the Black Death was a global catastrophe, leaving no corner of the known world untouched. From the bustling ports of Asia to the sprawling trade routes of Africa, the disease carved a path of destruction just as brutal and, in some cases, even more staggering. Take China, where the plague arrived decades before it reached Europe. The Yuan dynasty, already weakened by famine and unrest, crumbled under the weight of the pandemic. Chronicles from the time describe provinces where 9 out of 10 people perished, leaving fields littered with unburied bodies. Cities like Hangzhou, once a thriving hub of commerce and culture, became ghost towns. The devastation was so complete that some historians argue the Black Death hastened the fall of the Yuan dynasty, paving the way for the Ming uprising. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the plague tore through cities like Baghdad and Cairo with terrifying speed. Islamic scholars like Ibn al-Wardi documented entire neighborhoods wiped out in days, with corpses piled so high that survivors couldn't keep up with burials. The famed traveler Ibn Battuta wrote of Damascus losing thousands daily, its streets silent except for the calls of imams leading funeral prayers. Trade routes that had flourished for centuries, the lifeblood of empires, ground to a halt as merchants and caravan drivers died mid-journey, their goods rotting beside their bodies. Africa's suffering is often overlooked, but records from North African ports like Tunis and Alexandria tell a chilling story. The plague arrived aboard ships from Europe and the Levant, quickly spreading inland along the Nile. In Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate lost nearly 40% of its population, destabilizing a kingdom that had once been a regional powerhouse. Along the Swahili coast, thriving city-states like Kilwa saw their economies collapse as trade networks disintegrated. Even sub-Saharan Africa felt the ripple effects, with disrupted gold and salt trades triggering political upheavals that reshaped kingdoms for generations. What made the plague's global spread so catastrophic was its timing. The 14th century was an era of unprecedented connectivity, with Silk Road caravans, Indian Ocean voyages, and trans-Saharan trade linking continents. But this interconnectedness became a death sentence as rats, fleas, and unwitting travelers carried the disease from one bustling market to the next. A single infected ship docking in Calicut or Mogadishu could doom an entire region within weeks. Yet here's a haunting twist: some societies responded in ways Europe didn't. In parts of the Middle East, quarantines were enforced with brutal efficiency, while Chinese doctors pioneered early forms of protective clothing. But no amount of ingenuity could stop the tide. By the time the worst waves subsided, the world's demographic and economic maps had been redrawn, a grim reminder that pestilence knows no borders. As we'll soon see, the plague wasn't done yet. Even after its initial fury, it kept returning, a shadow that refused to fade. But just when survivors thought the nightmare was over, the plague proved it had a cruel staying power. What many don't realize is that the Black Death wasn't a one-time catastrophe. It became a recurring horror, flaring up every 10 to 20 years for centuries. This wasn't just a medieval problem, it haunted generations long after the initial devastation. Take the Great Plague of London in 1665, for example. By then, Europe had endured 300 years of sporadic outbreaks, but this one was particularly vicious. London lost nearly a quarter of its population in just 18 months. Diaries from the time describe streets lined with red crosses marking infected homes and the constant tolling of death carts collecting bodies. Daniel Defoe, in his chilling account, A Journal of the Plague Year, wrote of desperate families barricading themselves inside, while others fled only to carry the disease to new town. What made these later outbreaks so relentless? Unlike the original pandemic, which burned through populations like wildfire, the plague had become endemic, lingering in rodent colonies, then spilling back into human communities when conditions were right. Port cities were especially vulnerable. A single ship carrying infected rats could reignite an epidemic, as happened in Marseille in 1720, killing 50,000 people. Venice, once a pioneer of quarantine, saw repeated resurgences well into the 18th century. The cyclical nature of the plague reshaped societies in unexpected ways. Governments began investing in public health measures like permanent plague hospitals and stricter border controls. But fear also bred cruelty. During outbreaks in Milan and Vienna, authorities sometimes walled up entire households alive to stop the spread, leaving them to starve. Meanwhile, the wealthy developed a grim routine, fleeing to country estates at the first rumor of plague, then returning once the death tolls dipped. Perhaps the most tragic aspect was how normalcy coexisted with terror. Between outbreaks, people rebuilt, married, and traded, only for the cycle to repeat. In places like Amsterdam, records show plague years became almost predictable, with spikes in death rates every 15 years like clockwork. By the time the last major European outbreak hit Moscow in 1771, the plague had become a shadow over everyday life, a risk as familiar as it was horrifying. And yet, even as the world adapted, the question lingered: when would it strike next? The answer, as we'll see, lay not just in the rats and fleas, but in the very fabric of a changing world. Now, let's journey back in time to uncover where this nightmare truly began. The Black Death, as we know it today, may have had its origins not in Europe, but in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia. Deep in the rodent colonies of the region now spanning modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, the plague bacterium found its perfect breeding ground. Archaeological evidence from burial sites near Lake Issyk-Kul tells a startling story. Excavations have revealed tombstones from the 1330s bearing inscriptions like "Died of Pestilence," some of the earliest clear records of plague deaths. What's more, genetic testing of remains from these graves has identified traces of Yersinia pestis, the very same bacterium that would later ravage Europe. But how did it travel so far? The answer lies in the bustling trade networks of the Silk Road. Flea-infested marmots and other rodents thrived in the grasslands, and their parasites had no trouble jumping to the black rats that frequented merchant caravans. As goods moved westward, silks, spices, and sadly, disease, so did the plague. By 1346, it had reached the bustling Crimean port of Kaffa, where a notorious siege turned into a biological catastrophe. Legend has it that the Mongol army, stricken by the disease, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, intentionally spreading death. While historians debate whether this actually happened, one thing is certain: ships fleeing Kaffa carried the plague to Constantinople, and from there it exploded across the Mediterranean. What's fascinating is how long the plague had simmered before reaching Europe. Scientists now believe the strain responsible for the Black Death had been circulating in Central Asia for decades, if not centuries, before trade and war gave it a global stage. The steppe wasn't just a starting point, it was a reservoir, with outbreaks flaring whenever human and rodent worlds collided. Even today, the region remains a hotspot for plague cases, a grim reminder of how geography, commerce, and misfortune conspired to change history. The Silk Road, once a bridge between cultures, became an accidental highway for one of humanity's deadliest pandemics. But as the Black Death tightened its grip, desperation drove people to try anything to survive, no matter how bizarre or brutal. The medieval world had no understanding of bacteria or viruses, so when faced with a horror like the plague, they turned to remedies that often did more harm than good. Take bloodletting, for instance. Doctors believed illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, so they'd slice open veins or apply leeches to drain the sickness. Imagine enduring that while already weakened by fever and swollen lymph nodes. It's no wonder many patients bled to death before the plague could claim them. Then there were the so-called protective measures. Physicians wore those eerie beak masks stuffed with strong-smelling herbs like lavender or peppermint, thinking bad odors spread disease. They weren't entirely wrong about airborne transmission. Pneumonic plague could spread through coughs, but stuffing a mask with flowers did nothing to stop fleas or bacteria. Some even smeared onion paste or chopped up snakes onto buboes, the painful swellings caused by the plague, hoping to draw out the poison. Unsurprisingly, this just led to infected wounds on top of everything else. But perhaps the most shocking cure was drinking mercury. Yes, liquid metal. Alchemists swore by its purifying powers, not realizing it's violently toxic. Patients who drank it suffered vomiting, organ failure, and rotting gums, symptoms that probably made bystanders think the plague itself had gotten worse. Even the wealthiest nobles who could afford elite treatments weren't safe. King Charles VI of France's doctors prescribed ground emeralds, believing precious stones could counteract the disease. Spoiler, they couldn't, and let's not forget the religious remedies. Flagellants whipped themselves raw, convinced divine punishment caused the plague, while others drank holy water tainted with sewage. In a cruel twist, many of these cures accelerated death by further destroying the body or exposing it to new infections. It's a grim reminder of how fear and ignorance can spawn horrors rivaling the disease itself. Yet amid the madness, there were accidental bright spots. The failure of these treatments pushed some doctors to question ancient medical texts, planting early seeds for scientific medicine. But that's a story for another fact, one that reveals how the Black Death, in its wake, forced humanity to rethink healing from the ground up. Now, here's a turning point in the shadow of the plague, where desperation began to spark real change. As medieval remedies failed spectacularly, a quiet revolution took root in the halls of medicine. The Black Death didn't just wipe out lives, it exposed the fatal flaws in centuries-old healing traditions, forcing doctors to confront a hard truth: their methods were useless. And from that failure, modern medicine took its first shaky steps. Consider the autopsies. Forbidden by the church for generations, dissecting corpses was taboo until a plague made ignoring anatomy impossible. Doctors in Padua and Paris began cutting open victims, desperate to understand what was killing them. What they found: blackened organs, swollen lymph nodes, didn't match ancient Greek theories about imbalanced humors. This hands-on approach laid the groundwork for pathology, proving disease wasn't some mystical punishment but a physical phenomenon to be studied. Then came public health reforms. Venice, ravaged by the plague, pioneered the world's first quarantine system in 1377. Ships arriving from infected ports had to anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, giving us the word we still use today. Officials even organized pest houses to isolate the sick, a radical idea when most believed fleeing was the only option. These measures were crude by modern standards, but they marked a seismic shift. Health wasn't just an individual concern anymore, it was a civic duty. Even the role of doctors transformed. No longer just philosopher priests reciting Galen's texts, they became observers. Physicians like Gentile de Foligno documented symptoms meticulously, noting how pneumonic plague spread between people while bubonic cases seemed linked to filth. Though they didn't discover germs, their focus on contagion and sanitation edged medicine closer to science. And perhaps most surprisingly, the plague even reshaped medical education. Universities, once obsessed with theoretical debates, began emphasizing practical training. Students handled cadavers, studied case histories, and, for the first time, prioritized evidence over dogma. It was messy, halting progress, but it set the stage for figures like Vesalius and Harvey to revolutionize anatomy centuries later. So while the Black Death was a nightmare, its silver lining was this: it broke medicine's stagnant past. In the face of so much death, humanity finally started asking the right questions, and that, more than any herb or amulet, was the real cure. But amidst the chaos of recovery, another dark chapter unfolded, one where fear turned into fury and suspicion bred violence. The trauma of the Black Death didn't just fade away. It festered, twisting into paranoia that would haunt Europe for centuries, and one of its most tragic legacies. The explosion of witch hunts. Here's how it happened. When the plague struck, people scrambled for answers. Why was God punishing them? Who was to blame? In their terror, many latched onto scapegoats: Jews, foreigners, lepers, accusing them of poisoning wells or spreading disease through dark magic. These rumors weren't just whispers. They ignited mob violence, like the massacres in Strasbourg, where hundreds of Jews were burned alive in 1349. But even after the plague waned, the mindset lingered. If calamity struck, someone must have caused it. Enter the witch craze. By the 15th century, the idea that witches conspired to spread plague became entrenched. Church authorities, like the infamous Heinrich Kramer, author of the Malleus Maleficarum, argued that witches made pacts with the devil to unleash disease. Panicked communities began seeing signs of witchcraft everywhere: a neighbor's herbal remedy, a widow living alone, even a child's innocent remark. All it took was one bad harvest or fresh outbreak, and the accusations flew. The trials that followed were grotesque. Victims, overwhelmingly women, were tortured into confessing absurd crimes, riding broomsticks to plague-infested towns, brewing storms to drown crops, or cursing livestock. In Trier, Germany, entire villages saw their women executed in the 1580s after being blamed for renewed epidemics. Historians estimate that between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands died in this hysteria, a direct echo of the plague's paranoia. What makes this even darker, many so-called plague spreaders were actually healers. Midwives and folk doctors, often the only medical help in rural areas, became targets because their knowledge seemed suspicious. In a bitter twist, the very people trying to save lives were condemned as murderers. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it rewired how societies responded to crisis, replacing reason with dread and compassion with cruelty. And long after the last plague victim was buried, its shadow stretched into the flames of the witch trials, proving that sometimes the deadliest thing a pandemic leaves behind isn't disease but fear. Now let's turn to an unexpected shift in tradition: how the plague didn't just destroy lives, but transformed how we bury the dead. The horror of the Black Death didn't just reshape lives, it transformed death itself. Before the plague, burial was a sacred ritual. Families laid loved ones to rest in churchyards marked by crosses or stones, with priests offering last rites. But when corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, tradition shattered. Imagine streets lined with bodies, left to rot because gravediggers were either dead or too terrified to touch them. The sheer scale of death forced medieval Europe to reinvent how it handled the dead, leading to grim innovations that would leave a permanent mark. Mass graves or plague pits became the grim solution. Cities dug vast trenches outside town walls, dumping bodies by the hundreds. In London, emergency pits like the one at East Smithfield held over 2,000 corpses each, layered with lime to slow decay. Archaeologists later found these pits eerily organized, bodies laid in rows, some with hands folded as if in prayer, proof that even in chaos some clung to dignity. But not all were so lucky. In Florence, chroniclers described carts hauling corpses day and night, tipped into pits like lasagna layers between dirt. The stench was so unbearable, laws banned lingering near grave sites. The plague also birthed early public health laws. Venice, already a leader in quarantine, mandated rapid burials and banned funeral processions to curb contagion. In Pistoia, Italy, officials forbade moving corpses through streets, insisting they be wrapped in waxed cloth, a crude attempt at containment. Even the wealthy couldn't escape these rules. Nobles who once demanded elaborate tombs now found themselves tossed into pits alongside peasants. Death, the great equalizer, erased social hierarchies overnight. Perhaps the most haunting legacy, how these changes endured. Long after the plague faded, mass burials during crises became standard. The Great Plague of London in 1665 reused medieval pits, and the practice influenced modern disaster response. Today's emergency burial protocols, like those during the COVID pandemic, trace their roots to these desperate medieval measures. But here's what's even more startling. The Black Death didn't just change where we bury the dead. It reshaped our very relationship with mortality. The constant presence of death fueled macabre art, like the Danse Macabre frescoes showing skeletons leading the living to their graves. It also spurred legal reforms like England's Statute of Labourers, which included clauses on corpse disposal. In its wake, death became less a private grief and more a public problem, something to manage, not just mourn. Yet for all its innovations, one truth remained. No law, no pit, no desperate measure could fully erase the trauma. Even now, when archaeologists unearth plague pits, they find whispers of that terror. Coins placed on eyes, tiny toys buried with children, tokens of love in a world undone. The Black Death forced humanity to confront death on an unimaginable scale, and the scars of that reckoning are still with us. Now, let's turn to a chilling reality. The plague never truly disappeared. In fact, it's still lurking among us today, but here's something that might send a shiver down your spine. The Black Death never really left us. While we often think of it as a medieval nightmare confined to history books, the plague still lingers in pockets around the world. In fact, just a few years ago, Madagascar faced a terrifying outbreak, reminding humanity that this ancient killer hasn't vanished. It's merely lying in wait. The plague's modern presence is fueled by the same culprits that spread it 700 years ago: fleas and rodents. In rural areas of Africa, Asia, and even the western United States, outbreaks still flare up. Madagascar's 2017 epidemic infected over 2,000 people, with a death toll in the hundreds. The scariest part, this wasn't just the bubonic plague. Pneumonic cases spread person to person in crowded cities, mirroring the medieval horror of rapid contagion. Yet there's one critical difference between then and now: antibiotics. Modern medicine has turned the tide, transforming the plague from a death sentence into a treatable infection. Drugs like streptomycin and doxycycline can stop the bacteria in its tracks if caught early. That's why Madagascar's outbreak, though deadly, didn't spiral into a global catastrophe. Quick isolation, treatment, and flea control kept it contained, but don't breathe too easy. The plague's persistence exposes a chilling vulnerability. In remote regions with poor healthcare, delays in diagnosis still prove fatal, and antibiotic resistance, a growing global threat, could one day strip away our best defense. Scientists warn that without vigilance, the unthinkable could happen: a plague strain immune to modern medicine, forcing us back into a pre-antibiotic nightmare. The irony: medieval quarantine methods still help. In Madagascar, health workers used century-old tactics, isolating the sick, restricting travel alongside modern drugs. Even now, the CDC monitors plague-prone areas, with protocols echoing Venice's 1400 quarantine laws. It's a stark reminder that while science has given us tools, the basics of containment haven't changed. So why does the plague endure? Blame nature's stubbornness. The bacteria thrives in rodent populations, particularly prairie dogs in the US and black rats in Madagascar. Climate change may worsen the threat as warmer temperatures expand rodent habitats, And in a twist of cruel fate, the very mutations that saved some medieval Europeans, like the CCR5 Delta 32 gene, offer no shield against modern pneumonic plague. The takeaway: the Black Death isn't just history, it's a lurking shadow, but it's also a testament to human resilience. From mass graves to antibiotics, we've adapted, though the battle never truly ends. And that leaves us with one pressing question. In an era of superbugs and climate shifts, are we really safer than our medieval ancestors? The answer might unsettle you more than you think. Now, stepping back to see the full picture, the Black Death wasn't just a catastrophe, it was a catalyst. Its fingerprints are everywhere, from the way we bury our dead to the very DNA we carry. The plague didn't just kill millions, it rewired societies, shattered feudal systems, and left scars so deep they shaped the modern world. Think about it. The labor shortages that broke feudalism's grip gave rise to a new middle class. The desperation for answers spurred early public health measures like quarantine that still underpin our disease control today, and those genetic mutations that saved a handful of medieval survivors. Their descendants walk among us, living proof of nature's brutal editing. But the plague's legacy isn't just in history books or genetic code, it's in our collective psyche. The dance of death art that flourished after the pandemic wasn't just macabre decoration. It was a coping mechanism, a way to process unimaginable loss. That same urge to make sense of suffering echoes in our modern pandemic responses, from social distancing debates to vaccine hesitancy. The parallels are unsettling. Then, as now, fear bred misinformation, scapegoating, and wild theories. Here's what's truly haunting. The Black Death exposed how fragile civilization really is. A single bacterium riding on fleas and rats brought empires to their knees. And while we've traded medieval plague masks for N95s and mercury potions for antibiotics, our core vulnerabilities remain. Climate change is expanding rodent habitats, antibiotic resistance looms, and global travel can spread diseases faster than any 14th century merchant ship. So let's circle back to that provocative question: could we handle a Black Death-level pandemic today? On one hand, we've got science medieval minds couldn't dream of: genome sequencing, instant global communication, and drugs that crush the plague in days. But history warns us that tools alone aren't enough. Without trust, coordination, and equity, even the best defenses crumble. Madagascar's outbreak was contained not just by antibiotics, but by community cooperation and rapid action. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic showed how easily politics and disinformation can undermine progress. The real lesson: the Black Death forced medieval society to adapt or perish, and now it's our turn. Will we learn from their mistakes, or will future generations study our failures with the same grim fascination? That's the chilling legacy of the plague. It's not just about the past, but the futures we might face. So what do you think? Are we really prepared? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this deep dive into history's darkest pandemic gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because when it comes to pandemics, knowledge isn't just power, it's survival.